Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Karen Sieber. I'm the McGillicuddy Humanities Center's Humanities Specialist. And I'm very happy tonight to uh, introduce to you Leela Stockley. If you are not familiar with Leela, she is one of our uh, graduating undergraduate fellows right now at the McGillicuddy Humanities Center. If you are unfamiliar with the center, we put on a number of series of events throughout the year. We fund student research, faculty research, as well as just promoting the great things that are going on in the humanities here on campus. So at the culmination of our fellows research, they're with us for 2 semesters. They're awarded $8,000 over that 2 semesters so that they can really dig into whatever topic of their choosing is really just on their mind. And so we're really always looking for fellows that are passionate about what they're doing, finding ways to think critically outside of the box, and really take an interdisciplinary approach to their research. And so as you'll see tonight, Leela is a great example of what our fellows are capable of, and the impact that they're going on to have in the world. She's a prospective graduate student at the University of Maine, so we hope that we might be able to convince her to stick around here. Before we start any event on campus, I do always like to do a land acknowledgement. Let me get it up here. We are in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous people and their ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all of the Native communities who have lived here for thousands of generations in what is known today as Maine, New England, and the Canadian Maritimes. We make this acknowledgement aware of continual violations of water, territorial rights, and sacred sites in the Wabanaki homeland. And so with that, I hope to turn it over to Leela, who's going to talk a little bit about the research that she's been digging into over the past year with us, and how that relates to both current events as well as her planned career path as a journalist of color. This is something that she thinks quite a lot about. And so with that, I would like to introduce you to Leela Stockley.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. This whole presentation has been the culmination of over a year's worth of research into media and journalist behavior and the way that journalists function within the mediascape, as well as looking into Black Lives Matter protest coverage. I'm very excited to be able to share this with you, and I'm very thankful that the McGillicuddy Center has provided an opportunity for intersectional research because of my background as an undergraduate student, both in the field of journalism and the field of anthropology, has really led me to this path. And I'm very glad that I have had this outlet to be able to dive more into my own research and my own interests. So starting off, like I said, I am an anthropology and journalism undergraduate student. I will be graduating this spring. The McGillicuddy Center has allowed me to focus both of those experiences into this culmination of this research. And one of the things that really drove me to this research was the importance in the field of anthropology that pushes us to focus on the context of what we are talking about, what we're studying, why we're studying it. And it is really a very important aspect of research. And as an academic going through all of my undergraduate work, I've learned a lot about the value of bringing in various perspectives and being able to talk about why they are important to what we're studying and how we are approaching what we're studying. One of the things that really stood out to me is that journalism is constantly trying to provide context for events, for news issues, for cultural issues. Any good journalism is able to really present a diaspora of information and viewpoints. And I was really curious to see if there were any patterns in journalism that really showed the way that journalists can provide context for things. I was drawn to the Black Lives Matter movement because it has been around since the mid-2010s. And I wanted to know what context of of journalistic coverage of Black Lives Matter protests has been left out. Media, mass media is a very powerful engine for curating national discussions about social justice issues, about various political issues, and it is a way that we are able to share with each other the different events that are happening that affect our lives on a day-to-day basis. Even though media is able to curate these discussions, it doesn't always stay true to the form, and it doesn't always provide all of the context. And I really wanted to know, how can we look at journalism and see the gaps that are being presented to us. So I first started this research in the January of 2020. And as I was coming into this research topic, I noticed there's a varied discussion on Black Lives Matter protests ranging from 2014 to the present. However, in the May of 2020, we were confronted with a diaspora of media coverage of the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and numerous others that had been killed at the hands of police brutality. With the influx of this discussion and public opinion on Black Lives Matter, I saw the opportunity to take a closer look at Black Lives Matter protest coverage and identify gaps in the way that journalists were talking about these protests. So I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully. Alrighty, can everyone see that okay? Awesome, thank you, Professor Sokolow. All right, so this is just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. So the first concept that I really identified when I was doing this project that really showcased a way that we could identify patterns in journalism was the protest paradigm. And the protest paradigm is a framework that reporters can use to construct coverage of protest events. It has been used in multiple applications and is used on protests that are led by or have a large base of marginalized communities typically. There are numerous examples of this protest paradigm when you look at protests that are led by immigrants, ethnic minorities, proponents of civil rights movements, or even anti-war movements. There's usually some aspect of the protest paradigm involved in that media coverage. As a format, it really relies on reader bias and confirmation bias. It is a way that journalists rely on the reader to fill in gaps that they might not present. And I just want to note that it purposefully highlights negative aspects of a protest, and it shows an event that challenges social norms in a negative way. So the 5 elements of the protest paradigm are news framing, reliance on official sources, invocation of public opinion and social norms, delegitimizing language, and demonizing language that tries to support the idea the organizers or participants are not rational or credible actors. So it really paints a picture that shows that the people that are involved in protests may not know what they're doing, or they may not have grounds to protest, especially when a protest may challenge social norms in a way that many readers will find uncomfortable. The protest paradigm in application to Black Lives Matter protests does not have to use all 5 of these aspects. Usually 2 or 3 of these aspects take front and center of the conversation about Black Lives Matter, but you can, in many articles, find the use of all 5 of these elements. I'd like to elaborate a little bit on what each of these aspects of the protest paradigm are to give you guys a little bit more context about what this means in journalism. So, I didn't mean to do that, whoops. So news frames are the lens through which a journalist chooses to portray a story. I know that many people have seen headlines of GoFundMes for insulin and kids paying off their peers' lunch debt through a lemonade stand, and the way that journalists present those stories as like a positive impact outcome of a negative issue is a news frame. Something that is painted as a success story that may point to other social support systems not working. That's something that a journalist has chosen to say, this is something negative, but I'm going to portray it in a positive way so that people don't read into some of the underlying issues. It is an active choice by a reporter to choose certain details to include in the presentation of an issue to show ideas that challenge norms negatively. Reliance on official sources is demonstrated by journalists choosing to interview and quote officials such as town representatives and police or public safety spokespeople. This really is another example of confirmation bias where it counts on the idea that people are more likely to believe public representatives and believe that they are working in the interest of a community, whether that is a local, a state, or a national community. And it really enforces positive biases in favor of public service and safety members. And this is especially evident in the narrative of the Black Lives Matter movement, which really focuses on police brutality, where people are not necessarily willing to believe that police are not working in the interest of a specific group. The invocation of public opinion is a way that journalists can reinforce a reader's bias. It really uses quotes or testimonials that disavow protests or demonstrations because the actors of that protest may not have like a public interest in mind. It's that idea of what is a proper protest. How do you present something that challenges norms but is still not necessarily something that people want to confront. It can also convince readers that protest events are inconvenient and they disrupt everyday life. So if a protest ends up damaging public property, it's using public funds. So why would you want to support a protest if it's using taxpayer dollars? It requires citizen participation in issues that may not have majority support. So if you're not specifically tied to this issue, why do you care about this issue? It's not something that you should be thinking about. Delegitimizing and demonizing language kind of falls under the same umbrella, and it's basically a reliance on phrases that have negatively weighted or coded suggestive language. This can allude to family values, especially in certain contexts, or community values, and it can also include dog whistles, which are just subliminal messages that enforce a certain public opinion. In the context of Black Lives Matter protests, this can rely on using words like looting, rioting, unruly, and also highlighting vandalism and what can be construed as violent behavior. And it also prioritizes negative or violent connotations of a protest before it even presents the idea of peaceful protest or these actors participating in a peaceful protest. So now that I've given you some background, let's get on to my case study. So my case study focused on articles that specifically mentioned Black Lives Matter protests in the week following George Floyd's death. This was a really easy to approach, not necessarily easy morally and personally, but it was a easy environment to approach that because there was hundreds of thousands of articles about George Floyd's death and the protests that followed. So I was able to really get some really good context from a variety of news sources. I really focused my scope on major news outlets. So in this presentation, you will see an article from the Associated Press, an article from Time Magazine, an article from the New York Times, and an article from the Washington Post. Looking at this first slide, I wanted to point you to the Associated Press article, which is on the left-hand side of this slide. And I really wanted to kind of draw your attention to the Associated Press because it is a syndicated news outlet. It is often used as a media standard for covering national issues. There are reporters everywhere from the Associated Press, and they generate an article and then send it back, and then many other reporters from national news outlets will use Associated Press articles to help generate their own articles. And they really have prided themselves in trying to present unbiased news. So I thought it would be really interesting to look at this particular headline. Headline reads, George Floyd protesters set Minneapolis police station afire. It immediately is centering the protesters as causing damage and behaving violently, and it demonizes the protesters by alienating their actions and relating to acceptable protest. There is no mention of peaceful protest. There's no mention of the way that this protest was organized. It's simply telling you that these protesters were violent and they caused chaos. And then I wanted to look at some of the text of the article, which this is directly pulled from the first paragraph that this article presented. So the lead really confronts the reader with acts of vandalism and even shows protesters cheering and liking the behavior that has created public destruction of public property. This also shows the police department as passive actors in this event, and they are painted as victims of the violent protesters' actions, even if the protesters may not have been targeting police, but the reader is left to infer how the police were involved in that. And based on public opinion and social norms, we're most likely to believe that the police were simply defending their community. I also wanted to look at this Time magazine article. I chose this because Time magazine has really pushed to show diversity in their editorial content, especially over the past few years. They have featured entertainment industry standouts, including Megan Thee Stallion, Simone Biles. Recently, they featured the current Vice President Kamala Harris, and they have done interviews with Mrs. Michelle Obama, and they've really highlighted that they value that diversity. However, when you look at the headline, it shows that they don't really want to encourage commentary, and they show the protesters as violent and police as reactionary. The language that they're using shows that protesters clashed with officers in riot gear. There isn't really any context for why the police were in riot gear, and you are left to assume that the protesters were behaving in a deviant manner. Why would a police department need to deploy tear gas on peaceful protesters? Because this article paints that the protesters were not peaceful and that you almost want to infer that they deserved the tear gas. The body text of this article uses testimonial from a police spokesperson and sidelines any commentary on the protesters' perspective. I wasn't able to show the full article, but if you ever get the opportunity to check it out, I really wanted to note that this article sidelines quotes from George Floyd's family and avoids discussion of Black Lives Matter and protests. The quotes were sidelined by the police testimony of the need to react and to subdue protesters without illustrating the true nature of the protest. My next slide, I really wanted to focus on how headlines can show confrontation versus ambiguity. While one of these headlines really shows the interaction between police and protesters, the New York Times headline seems to provide context and show that this was the event that has sparked protest. I know that many people are probably familiar with clickbait and sensationalism headlines. Throughout this, we've seen a reliance on outrage and framing protesters as violent or unruly. But I just wanted to kind of put this in there and show that clickbait can also work in the opposite manner, rather than having something that's sensationalized and then having the body content be like not necessarily what you expect. A passive headline can show that the news agency is trying to be sympathetic, while the body of the text can actually show a different story. So looking at the Washington Post, I noticed, first of all, that the headline highlights chaos. Again, it's calling on the reader's confirmation bias. You, at this point in your media journey, people would probably expect to see negative commentary on protesters. And this really just shows you like they were being chaotic. It relies on the fact that we want to believe that people were behaving in a way that was challenging social norms. None of these articles have highlighted protesters' speeches or alternative action that protesters have taken, such as sit-ins or educational outreach. I know that a number of Black Lives Matter protest organizers have really worked with their communities to create dialogue about how to create social support systems, but you really have to dig to find stories like that. And that is not the conversation that is highlighted at the front of Black Lives Matter protests. I also wanted to note that the way that people interpret police relationships with a community, people tend to expect that police are going to protect the public, and because they are supposed to be public service members. And in the body of the Washington Post article, a group of officers stood in front of a nearby precinct and tried to disrupt the crowd with flashbang grenades and rubber bullets. How is that protecting a group that is vulnerable and trying to exercise their right to protest? Hello? Oh, okay. And it is also showing that the protest seems really an inconveniencing event. Like I said before, with demonizing language, it can show that a protest isn't in public interest. And they're showing that it was affecting an entire neighborhood where people were being affected by tear gas, even if they weren't involved with the protest. And that really sways the opinion of protest towards a negative manner if it's affecting someone that doesn't want to be involved in something like that. This last article I want to look at is the New York Times article, and I think it's really interesting to look at this when you're considering the protest paradigm and previous protest coverage. It shows the event. It is trying to provide some context. It shows the event that sparked the protest, and there is no allusion in the headline to the protesters' behavior, and the subhead actually shows a invocation of a public opinion that says that's in sympathy of protester actions. However, when you look at the body of this text, it is using police testimony, and it shows protesters are vandalizing police property, which really highlights again how media tends to look at the violent and the violent manner of protests rather than focusing on ways that protests had largely been peaceful across the United States in the months following the death of George Floyd. And it really does a disservice to the Black community and other communities that were participating in these protests. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up. That was my case study. And so I wanted to kind of end with a couple of comments on how to combat media bias and just what these articles do and how they are truly harmful in a bigger scope and as part of a bigger conversation. Many protest stories can follow this pattern, and it doesn't have to necessarily be applied to Black Lives Matter. I'm sure that you would be able to see this if you looked at some of the protests that have happened in favor of LGBTQ rights, especially in other countries where LGBTQ rights are not at the forefront of a social political consciousness. One of the major negative aspects of the use of the protest paradigm is that it really creates a social narrative that protesters are not credible and might not be protesting for the right reason when they're challenging social norms. It also casts negative stereotypes onto Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and in the case of Black Lives Matter, specifically onto Black communities. Black communities are already impacted by a negative social connotation of the violent or angry Black woman or Black man, and by reinforcing that, it becomes even harder for the average media consumer to sympathize with Black Lives Matter protests and even to sympathize with racial equity and justice efforts. In order to really combat media bias, it is important for people to consider how your media is produced and who is producing it. I have a couple of statistics that I thought were just interesting to share. In a 2018 study by the Columbia Journalism Review, a survey found that all major media outlet newsrooms are predominantly white, including reporters and editors. The Washington Post has a base of, a staff room of 70% white people. However, in the surrounding communities and their target communities, the District of Columbia is comprised of 50% non-white population, and that includes Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, and Asian communities. The state of Maryland is 38% non-white, and the state of Virginia is 41% non-white. And it is very interesting to consider how these news outlets are trying to curate news that is relevant and impactful to these communities while not necessarily serving the needs of that community. The New York Times is their staff is 81% white, while the demographics of the tri-state area is New York State is 65% non-white, Connecticut is 32% non-white, and New Jersey is 41% non-white. So really looking at the people that are producing the news are not necessarily indicative of the people that are consuming and embroiled with the news. I also think that it's very important to identify some biases that may exist in your environment. Be aware of the language that your workplace, peers, or classwork may use when discussing marginalized identities. I know that especially in recent months, there has been a catch up in trying to be able to have conversations about how we are treating our peers and our educators and the way that we're talking about social justice issues, but it is still present, especially when you look at places in rural Maine and in other rural communities. And if you are anyone that is practicing journalism, I would say that you need to be aware that especially in newsrooms where people go through internships and they go through freelance work, a lot of senior reporters that may have been there for 10, 15 years already have biases that are part of the way that they function within their news staff. And those biases can very easily rub off if you are not critical of the way that you're conducting yourself. I know that I have had an experience. I worked as a freelance reporter for my local hometown paper, and I live in a very small town in northern Maine, and there has never really been that much dialogue about how to talk about race and racial bias, especially in my newsroom. And there was an incident over the summer where some of the police officers from my hometown were investigated for sharing on their Facebook pages racial slurs and imagery that was reminiscent of Confederate values. And as a 21-year-old reporter, I was being asked to help a reporter that had been working at that paper for more than 15 years to understand, like, how do we discuss this in a way that is appropriate and provides context without alienating our readers, because we do live in northern Maine. And that was a very difficult situation to be in because I am not a seasoned journalist. I don't know how to always reach my audience, but then being asked at a young age to be able to consult and help an older journalist was a very interesting experience for me. The rest is basically just being conscious of the way that you are conducting yourself in public spaces, in your spaces with your friends, in classrooms. It is really important to be open and receptive to constructive criticism from others who may be closer to an issue and closer to a marginalized experience. And we can always continue to educate ourselves and actively engage in social justice and equity causes. That can be, for some of you, participating in bias training or diversity training. And for some of us, that might just be getting involved in a local event or being present at something that is talking about these issues. Finally, I just wanted to present some final questions that I'd like you all to kind of think about when you are looking at media. What can you do to really question how you are perceiving your media, and not necessarily overturning all of your preconceived biases, but recognizing that they are there? So ask yourself, does that headline seem weighted? Does it seem like it's trying to portray something that doesn't have to be negative in a negative way? Who is narrating this article that you're reading? Is the reporter that is producing this content, are they a local reporter? Are they close to this issue? Do they have some sort of experience with this issue? I know that with local papers, it's a lot easier to do that. I follow a couple of journalists that work at the Bangor Daily News, and I know that they have a lot of experience with curating these discussions. But then you get into your widely distributed newspapers, and it's a little bit harder to tell. But just thinking of the context that these reporters are working in. Whose voices are being highlighted or left out of an article that you're reading? Are you hearing from the people that are involved in the issue, or are you hearing from sources that are narrating the people that are involved in that issue? How is the issue being framed? You can read any story and say, oh, this is really cool, but is it framing something in a way that encourages your bias to think that it is fairly weighted, or is that just something that you want to assume because you want to reinforce your own interpretation of your social norms? And is this article constructive to understanding the bigger picture? There are a lot of articles out there that are just spitting out the same content every day, and they don't necessarily help us to be more informed. They don't necessarily help us to be more critical of the way that we are thinking about important issues. And are you reading something that is actually helping your understanding, or is it just a puff piece that seems easy to read? And most importantly, how can you continue to educate yourself about issues outside of major mass media outlets? It is very important, I think, that in our eternal pursuit of education, that we are not only looking at mass media and looking at what is the news telling us and what are our peers telling us, and what are the organizations that you are involved with on your campus, in your community, telling you, and how do they contribute to that conversation? So that is pretty much all I have for questions. I would like you to all kind of sit with these and think about this next time you read a story. And finally, I would like to wrap that up and say thank you for offering me this space. I did want to offer a couple of resources to any students that might be here. Please reach out to your local racial equity and justice and organizations, whether that is the Black Student Union. They are very welcome to people of all backgrounds. I've been very lucky to attend a couple of meetings. There are various student organizations that support students from all different backgrounds to come and talk about current event issues. And I would absolutely encourage you to reach out to them. Feel free to reach out to the McGillicuddy Humanities Center. We have a whole lot of different resources that we would be able to provide. And the Multicultural Student Center and the Intersectional Feminist Resource Center are very good places to start on campus to kind of get involved in conversations about these issues. A final note, I will be producing a podcast on this content that will, at this point in time, it is a 4-part series, but I'm hoping to expand that to cover some other topics that I wasn't able to cover in today's presentation. And also for anyone that is interested, the trial for Derek Chauvin, who is one of the police officers involved in George Floyd's death, will be on March 8th. And if you would like to follow along with that and kind of critically think about some of the content that is being produced around that trial, I would encourage anyone to be engaged in that conversation. So thank you all, and I will be available to take questions.
Wonderful. Well, we have a few questions that are coming in. And so the first one is, we've talked about ways to identify newspapers and headlines that could be doing a little bit better, but are there some good media outlets out there that are doing things right, that are examples of newspapers that have provided a little bit more context and have gone into it, in a little bit more of a comprehensive manner, representing both sides?
I would say one of the things that I would really recommend people to look at is to look at a local newspaper in the town or the area that an event is happening. I know that a number of the local newspapers that were number of the newspapers that were in and or around the Minneapolis area had some really good coverage of protests. And because they already have those community ties, they were able to get some really good quotes for those. So I would encourage anyone looking at protest coverage specifically to look at a local newspaper that is covering that rather than going to a large mass media outlet.
Okay. On a similar note, the McGillicuddy Center's former director, Margot Lukens, has asked what your thoughts are regarding the work of NPR or public broadcasting networks in general that are kind of, in a way, similar to the Associated Press in that they are supposed to be this kind of neutral medium that is meant to truly just, get information out there. But at the same time, at least those on the other side are often seeing NPR as, the liberal enemy. So are there, beyond traditional print sources, are there other places like NPR or blogs or podcasts or people that you follow
That's
on
a really
Twitter?
good question. And unfortunately, I am not as well educated on broadcast media. That hasn't been my forte so far. Um, I know just from experience and from my own interaction with NPR, there are very specific, I would say that there are specific time slots where they know that certain people, they're reaching a certain demographic, and that is when either more liberal or more balanced media is being produced. So I would kind of consider, what time of day are you listening to something? What like we do with the television, there are certain slots for certain things because they are trying to reach a certain audience. So just think about, like, what time of day are you listening to this? And is this actually bringing in voices about, like, holding interviews with people that are close to this, or are they academics that are commenting on this, and maybe doing some research on the people that they bring on to these shows, I think would be what I would say.
Wonderful. Can you stop screen sharing on your end, Leela? So kind of a related question to that. Someone had asked what your personal media consumption routine is. When you get up in the morning, I know you're active on Twitter. I know that you read a lot of different local newspapers. What is your route for kind of, grounding yourself at the start of a day and getting a grasp for the news?
I hate reading the news first thing in the morning. It is really not my vibe. I'm very lucky to have, with my involvement with the Maine Campus, to get a lot of press releases. And I find that those are often more helpful than going straight to news sources first thing in the morning. But I know that not everyone has access to those. And not everyone has the wherewithal to want to be involved in that. As far as my media consumption, I don't use Twitter for news. I really don't like using Twitter for news because I know that their algorithms are constantly changing and the way that they're trying to target different audiences is constantly changing. If I scroll through and I see a really interesting article, I have the Pocket extension on Firefox, which I think is really helpful because I'm able to just get a quick clip of something and then go back and revisit it. I don't have any subscriptions to any of the big media outlets. I do have a subscription to the Bangor Daily News, and I do try to read through their front page headlines like once every other day or something like that. And then if there's something that I'm really interested in, I'd like to do a quick Google search and kind of skim past the first 4 or 5 entries of that, I think, and then you can get to some interesting blogs and some interesting commentary from people that might be more involved in that.
I'm going to pivot back to your comment earlier about your work up in Lincoln, working for a local newspaper. I actually love what you had to say about about them asking you for your opinion, because I think we've had this discussion that that I feel that everybody over 40 should have a mentor who's under 40. That just as much as we have to offer you, that there's plenty that we can be learning from people in your generation. So there's a question that came in related to that, because you do kind of have this experience working for a small town paper, and because we know that across the nation, small town papers are struggling, conglomerates, and move to digital and that kind of thing. Do you think that that pressure on small town papers is affecting their ability to kind of, has it increased or decreased the amount of bias that you see? Is it forcing papers to do more AP stories and less writing?
That's a really interesting and multidimensional question, I think. One thing, as a staunch proponent of newspapers, I will always read my local newspaper, regardless of what format it is in, regardless of whether I'm living in the area. That's something that I think is very important to support that. And I've seen recently just some discussion between local journalists and journalists that are working all across the country, and just seeing some commentary on the fact that local newspapers are really becoming sources that are much more reliable and much more invested in actually providing coverage of these big issues, and they're becoming much more valued, I think, by reporters than these big mass media syndicates. And one of the driving factors behind that is that, one, a lot of these mass media syndicates are owned by these people that might not even have any involvement or investment in news. You can look at the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos. That's something that's very diverged from his interests, I think, throughout his career in the spotlight. And it's really interesting because people are being, especially in an age where we're more critical of how people are controlling information, I think that people are much more willing to turn to a local newspaper. On that note, I don't know if there's a comprehensive way to understand how bias is evolving in these smaller newspapers. I think it depends on the area, because you have like the Penobscot Times, which is located near a college town, and the demographic that reads it might not be the same as the demographic that's reading the Lincoln News. Politically, if you look at northern Maine, it leans much more towards a red vote, and when you look towards southern Maine, it leans much closer towards a blue vote. And although this isn't necessarily about political ideology and political affiliation, it does play a huge part in the way that stories are constructed and the way that journalists are assessing what the readers want to know. Because you can still have a protest story, but it's going to leave out certain issues, because a local reporter will know that, well, this demographic of 60 plus isn't going to want to read about XYZ.
So
Leela,
for the
may I
readers,
please interject here?
Yeah.
sure.
I'm sorry if I am like stepping out of bounds. I'm so sorry, Kerry. I'm so sorry. I've known Leela for more than 3 years now. She's the only person who has taken charge of the University of Newspaper at Maine. And I know Leela was attacked racially and otherwise. And it's not something she likes to talk about because it's on her honor. She doesn't like to talk about these things. But she did it. How did you do it, Leela?
What was that? I'm sorry, I can't hear you that well.
I said, no one talks about how Leela was assaulted for being brown.
That's a really
And I
very
remember
complex.
those days. I remember those days during in the lead up to the presidential election. when you had to go and you were like really challenged and assaulted? How did you overcome that to be the person that you are?
um, I am gonna hand that one off to my mom, raising me to be a very strong and self-aware person, I think. And I know that in my time at the university, I've had a lot of different reckonings, I think, with my own identity and my own space and the way that I take up space and that I occupy space. I think that overall, I have been very lucky to have a community that has not ever forced me to reckon with how my race impacts my perspective, I think. I'm not quite sure how I want to say that.
And this is a discussion that I'm bringing up because of your wonderful work that you've done. And I just want to go back to where it comes from. And, like the whole idea of where do you come from? And how does it matter so much to you? And, I have known you for almost 3 years now.
Mhm.
And I've seen the greatest person that you have been. But someone has to acknowledge where you come from.
I am very,
What is it you
very
have?
proud of the fact that I am Indian. I'm also very proud of the fact that I was raised in Maine. And I think that that's really kind of opened up a lot of interesting inquiries for myself. And one of the biggest things going into this, that one of my biggest anxieties going into this research is the fact that I have friends that are much closer to this conversation than I am, because I am not a Black person. I do not have to deal with the issues that Black people around the country and Black people in Maine have to deal with. And I think that the major way that I overcame that anxiety was just understanding that as a journalist, this is really important to talk about. And I am not a monolith of information, and I will always encourage people to go outside of my information that I'm providing, and talk to other people and say, well, I heard this. What do you think of that? Because I have always been very engaged in constructive criticism. I think that it has helped me a lot to get to the place that I am. I've had some interesting hard knocks in life, and they haven't always led to the best output, I think, of that energy. But I have along the way found that even if I am not a expert on something, I can create a conversation where I will be allowed to explore. And I think that just, I've always been encouraged to ask questions. As a kid, I was told that I asked a lot of questions. And I remember like going to library reading groups and them stopping in the middle of a reading group and me being like, well, why is that like that? And I think that having an environment that has pushed me outside of my own comfort zone and when I'm asking those questions has really helped me to kind of create this identity that I feel comfortable with now.
I did not mean to at all put you in a spot.
No, that's okay.
I was only instigating you about exactly what you said.
Yeah, no, I absolutely credit a lot of my
You are incredibly talented.
Thank you.
You're incredibly greater than the story that you put out today and the research you put out today.
Thank you.
Everybody needs to hear just how cool Leela Stockley is.
She's actually hoping to kind of build off of this research. So not just in her work at graduate school or in her career plans, but she has plans for a really great podcast right now that she has already kind of been recording a few episodes and has ideas kind of in the works for the future. So I'm hoping, Leela, that we can get you to talk for a moment about the podcast and some topics that you kind of want to dig into further and what conversations you would like to see spurred from that. Like, who is your intended audience?
Yeah.
Thinking about this.
So when I was thinking about the podcast, I've never really done any audio production like that. And I've listened to podcasts since I was, mid-teens. Some of you might be familiar with the Welcome to Night Vale. That was really what got me into podcasts. But in this particular environment, I am not serving as a fictional storyteller. This is very much real world dialogue. But I really want to be able to frame that in a way that connects a lot of different ideas. I think that especially over the past couple of months with institutions that are reckoning with how are they serving their student base that really wants to talk about these issues. How are people engaging with topics of nationalism? And especially when we look at what happened on January 6th, what was the narrative that was kind of being promoted during that, and how does that impact the way that we go forward from that? And I think that I really just want to generate a conversation of the way that these ideas are presented might not necessarily impact you personally, but it does help you form your own biases. And biases can be good and they can be bad. They don't necessarily have to always be a negative thing. But just asking yourself, what bias is this informing? And what can I do with this information? And am I going to turn that into a larger narrative? And I think that I really want to encourage everyone here. And I know that some of you are students, some of you are not students, but I really want to encourage everyone to be able to have those difficult conversations with yourself, and think about what is the intent of what you are engaging with. Because I think that especially now with social media and things, we follow people that our friends follow, and we reshare things and we retweet things and you quote tweet things, but like, are you actually putting out a positive reaction to something? Are you engaging with something, or are you just kind of blindly going with what people say? And I know I had a conversation with my friend the other day, and they asked me, like, how does social media fit into all of this research that you've been doing? And on that note, I kind of wanted to say that, like, when you're looking at these influencers, what is their goal? Because most of the times they want to get ad sponsorships, or they want to get more followers, and they want to be able to sell a product. But there are influencers that are huge proponents of social justice values. But who are they getting their information from, and how does that form the way that you are carrying yourself on social media? Because even though you might not have a public Instagram, you might not have a public Twitter, that's still something that you're carrying those values with you, and they impact your interactions with people in real life or on Zoom or however that works now. So how are you culturing your own values?
So I know a lot of time, like recently in the news, I always try to read things from both sides of the aisle, and and I hear the arguments. I'm a bleeding heart liberal, if it's not obvious, but I hear the arguments from the other side that say the liberal media is biased and that kind of thing. So is there a way in which this can be examined in the reverse, of the recent Capitol protests or that kind of thing? Is there a way that in general newspapers on both sides of the aisle can kind of work better to create a medium? Or is this, I think of it as being more of an issue on
I
the
think
side of
that,
the Black Lives Matter protest and that kind of thing than on the
yeah,
other. But it's something to think about. As you said, newspapers kind of typically are Republican newspapers or Democratic newspapers, and that's historically been the case. Newspapers, have always had a little bit of bias here and there, but is there some way that newspapers kind of, or media outlets across the board, can be doing better to find some kind of medium that's as close to the truth as possible? Or
yeah, I think that in that aspect, I would really encourage reporters from these large syndicate newspapers to really take a look at local newspapers again, because you have, in some senses, local newspapers exist within somewhat of a vacuum of this is a local community that we're serving, but they also do not have the luxury of, we have a right-wing newspaper and we have a left-wing newspaper that is serving this small community. So there is more pressure, I think, to be more true to form. And I think that there is no good answer for how to solve the media crisis that we are in right now. And part of that is just the conduct of the past administration really created a very hostile environment for reporters. And I think that there's a statistic out there that says that like the last 4 years were some of the deadliest years for journalists in the United States, that were facing social and personal ostracization and all of these other threats from the environment that was created by that administration. And even though we have Joe Biden in office right now, he's not going to solve all of these problems in the first month. He's not going to solve all of these problems in the first 4 years. And whether he gets another term or not is to be determined. But I don't think that even in 8 years, he can change that narrative, because now you have platforms who have, what's the new one? Parler? You have all of these new like niche communities, and they're much more reminiscent of blog communities, but they do have a lot of power because they have a lot of star power, and they have people that are very involved in public discourse. And it's going to be very difficult. And I think that editors and publishers have to really look at, do people want to keep reading things that are extremely polarizing, or are people going to get tired of that? And I personally, from the perspective of a 21-year-old, I think that a lot of my peers are getting to a point where they're very exhausted by this constant back and forth of media. And we have a lot of younger people that are coming into these positions that are actually going to be able to alter the narrative that media is creating. So there is hope for the future.
One last question, kind of related, to tie everything up before we get going. If we did not get to your question, or if you have additional questions that you would like to ask, Leela is more than happy to chat with you via email.
Absolutely.
Email her.
I have no questions but to say that Leela Stockley, you're a superstar. Go forth.
So one last question.
And email me, and I'm also going to put my Twitter handle in the group chat.
Wonderful. So, we have been placing a lot of this on the media outlets themselves, on the journalists themselves. What can media consumers, the public, be doing to kind of call out local newspapers or draw attention to issues, or what kind of power can they take themselves to hold the media more accountable, or to draw attention?
Yeah, I think that really being present at public events that are in favor of social justice issues, even if you are not someone that may be directly connected to that, people power is very important and impactful. And the more people that are at an event that may gain criticism, the less easy it will be to kind of smear that imagery. I know that there are a number of upstanding citizens from the Bangor area that have attended Black Lives Matter protests, both in Bangor and Portland in the past year. And that has really been a huge part of their platform of being able to say, like, this is something that we support. And it is so much harder for media to paint that as a negative thing if there is support behind that. Personally, that's a kind of a hard one, but just keep educating yourself and write to your local newspaper. That's something that people can still do. And I think that a lot of people kind of forget that. I love reading opinion columns that are from local people. That's one of my favorite things to do on the Bangor Daily
webpage. I don't always read front page news, but I will go to the opinion section and see like, oh, well, this is someone that one of my professors told me about, or, oh, this is someone that like my parents are friends with and they have an opinion. And whether I agree with it or not, that's a whole other can of worms, but it is very interesting and it informs the way that our newspapers are interacting with us as people and seeing us as people that have individual stories and individual narratives.